Velros read the orders on his datapad for the third time, still not quite believing what he was seeing. After 12 years of service in the Korthan Imperial Fleet, he was being assigned to a joint operation with humans. Humans, the small, fragile creatures who had only joined the Galactic Council 15 years ago, the species that barely reached his chest and had no natural armor or enhanced strength. He stood in the transport bay, his 8-foot frame covered in the traditional Korthan combat exoskeleton. The dark blue armor was marked with the scars of a dozen campaigns. Around him, other Korthan warriors prepared their equipment, their faces showing the same mixture of curiosity and mild amusement that Velros felt. "They say humans are clever," said Torvak, one of his squad members. "Clever with technology, clever with words. But in a real fight?" He laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "We'll see." Velros nodded but said nothing. He had read the reports about humans. They were indeed clever. Their technology was advancing rapidly, though it still lagged behind most galactic species. They were diplomatic, eager to learn, and remarkably adaptable. But in combat, the reports were sparse. Humans had only fought in 3 minor conflicts since joining the Council, all of them brief skirmishes that ended quickly. The transport touched down on Talos 9 3 hours later. The fortress world was exactly what its name suggested, a massive military installation built on a barren planet that served as a choke point between Council space and the outer territories. It was the perfect place to stop an invasion before it reached populated systems. As Velros stepped off the transport, he saw the human section of the base for the first time. Their structures were different from Korthan architecture, more compact, more efficient, with multiple layers of defensive positions. Human soldiers moved through the area with purpose, carrying equipment and supplies. They were so small, even the largest human soldier barely reached Velros' shoulder. Their armor looked thin and light compared to Korthan gear. They carried weapons that seemed almost toy-like in comparison to the heavy plasma cannons the Korthans preferred. A human officer approached the Korthan group. He was of medium height for his species, with dark hair and calm eyes. His uniform was clean but showed signs of long use. "Welcome to Talos 9, the human said in perfect galactic standard. "I'm Captain Han Day, commander of the 3rd Human Defense Unit. We're glad to have Korthan support for this operation." Velros noticed that the captain did not salute or bow. Humans apparently treated all soldiers as equals regardless of species. It was an interesting cultural difference. "I am Velros, squad leader of the Korthan 16th Battle Group," he replied. "We are here to assist in the defense of this position." Captain Day nodded. "Then let's get you briefed. Commander Wu Jin is waiting in the operations center." The operations center was deep inside the fortress, protected by layers of armor and defensive systems. Inside, a large holographic display showed the surrounding space and planetary surface. A senior human officer stood studying the display, his hands clasped behind his back. "Commander," Captain Day said, "the Korthan reinforcements have arrived." Commander Wu Jin turned. He was older than Captain Day, with gray hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of many years in service. He looked at the Korthan warriors without any sign of intimidation, which Velros found mildly surprising. Most species showed some nervousness around Korthans. "Welcome," Wu Jin said simply. He gestured to the display. "Let me show you what we're facing." The hologram shifted, showing enemy positions in the outer system. Red markers indicated thousands of ships. "The Skrell Collective is moving toward Talos 9 with a major invasion force," Wu Jin explained. "Our intelligence suggests they'll hit this fortress first to secure a staging point for deeper strikes into Council space." Velros studied the display. The Skrell were an aggressive species, known for winning through overwhelming numbers rather than superior technology. They bred quickly and saw individual soldiers as expendable resources. "How many defenders do we have?" Velros asked. 800 total, Wu Jin replied. 200 humans, 400 Korthan warriors, and 200 from various other Council species. The Skrell will likely attack with 10,000 troops in the first wave. Torvak laughed. 10,000 Skrell against Korthan weapons. They'll break on our walls like water. Wu Jin's expression didn't change. Perhaps. But the Skrell don't break easily. They'll keep coming until they overwhelm us or run out of soldiers. Then we kill them until they stop coming, Torvak said with confidence. Captain Day spoke quietly from the side. The Skrell have never stopped coming. Not in any recorded battle. Something in his tone made Velros look at him more carefully. The captain's face was calm, but his eyes held a knowledge that Velros couldn't quite identify. The briefing continued for another hour. Velros learned that the fortress had strong defensive positions, good fields of fire, and plenty of ammunition. The plan was simple: hold the walls, destroy the attackers, and wait for reinforcements to arrive in 7 days. After the briefing, Velros and his squad were assigned to the eastern wall section. As they walked through the fortress, Velros observed the human soldiers preparing for battle. They worked with systematic efficiency, checking weapons, preparing medical supplies, and setting up what looked like backup defensive positions far behind the main walls. "Why are they preparing fallback positions?" Velros asked Captain D, who was guiding them to their assigned sector. "Standard human doctrine," D replied. "We prepare for every possibility." "You expect the walls to fall?" "We prepare in case they do. Better to have a plan and not need it than need a plan and not have it." Velros found this approach overly cautious, but he said nothing. Perhaps humans, being physically weaker, needed to think more defensively. The eastern wall gave a clear view of the approaches to the fortress. Miles of empty, rocky ground stretched out before them. The Skrell would have to cross all of that open space under defensive fire. It should be simple. As evening approached, Velros stood watch alongside a human sergeant named Quan Tai. The human was quiet, methodically checking and rechecking his equipment. He had done this same check 3 times in the last hour. "Are you nervous?" Velros asked. Quan Tai looked up at him. "Always. But we have superior position and firepower." "True. Then why be nervous?" Quan Tai was quiet for a moment, then said, "Fear keeps you sharp. Overconfidence kills you." Velros considered this. In his 12 years of service, he had never felt true fear in combat. Concern, yes. Heightened alertness before battle, certainly. But fear? No, the Korthan advantages in strength, armor, and weapons had always been overwhelming. Victory had always been certain. "I have never been afraid in battle," Velros admitted. Quan Tai looked at him with an expression that might have been pity or understanding. Velros couldn't tell which. Then, "You've never been in a real fight," the human said quietly. Before Velros could ask what he meant, alarms began to sound throughout the fortress. Lights flashed on the walls. Voices called out over communication systems. Commander Wu Jin's voice came through every speaker. "All units to battle stations. Skrell forces detected entering atmosphere. Estimate contact in 30 minutes. This is not a drill." Around him, human soldiers moved to their positions with practiced speed. There was no panic, no shouting, just smooth, efficient movement. Velros activated his armor's combat systems and charged his plasma cannon. This would be his first time fighting alongside humans. He was curious to see how they performed in actual combat. Captain Day's voice came over the communication channel, calm and steady. "All units, weapons free when targets enter range. Stay sharp, remember your training." Velros looked out over the empty ground before the fortress. Somewhere out there in the growing darkness, 10,000 Skrell soldiers were coming. It should be an easy defense. The Korthans had held positions against worse odds many times before, but as Velros glanced at the human soldiers around him, checking weapons, helping each other with equipment, their faces calm but serious, he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. It wasn't quite worry. It wasn't quite doubt. He didn't have a name for it yet, but he would learn. The waiting was over. The battle was about to begin. Dawn broke over Talos 9 with a red sky. Velros had been awake all night watching the horizon. Now, as the sun rose, he saw them. The Skrell came across the rocky ground like a dark wave, thousands of them, moving in loose formations toward the fortress. They were shorter than humans, with thick gray skin and 4 arms. Each one carried crude weapons, but they made up for quality with quantity. Range 1,200 meters in closing, Lieutenant Yuna's voice came over the communications channel. The human scout was positioned in one of the high towers, calling out enemy movements with mechanical precision. Velros raised his plasma cannon. Around him, other Korthan warriors did the same. These weapons could cut through armor and flesh like it was paper. Each shot could kill multiple enemies. Range 1,000 meters, Yuna reported. "All Korthan units," Velros called out. "Prepare to fire on my mark." The Skrell kept coming, spreading out but still maintaining dense groups. "Perfect targets, fire," Velros commanded. Blue plasma bolts shot out from the Korthan positions, lighting up the morning sky. The bolts hit the Skrull formations and exploded, throwing bodies through the air. Dozens fell with each shot. The Korthan warriors fired again and again, their powerful weapons creating a wall of death between the fortress and the attacking army. For the first hour, it was almost easy. The Skrull had no answer to the Korthan firepower. They fell by the hundreds, unable to get within 500 meters of the walls. Bodies piled up on the rocky ground, creating obstacles that slowed the following waves. Velros felt vindicated. This was what Korthan military superiority looked like. The humans' excessive preparation seemed foolish now. This battle would be over before noon, but the Skrull kept coming. "They're not stopping," Torvak said, sounding surprised. "We've killed at least 1,000, but they're still advancing." "Let them come," Velros replied. "We have plenty of ammunition." Then something changed. The Skrull stopped their direct charges. Instead, they began dragging their dead forward, piling the bodies into barriers. They advanced in tighter formations, using their own fallen as shields against the plasma fire. "They're adapting," Captain Day's voice came over the channel, still calm. "All human units switch to precision fire. Aim for gaps in their formations." The human soldiers began firing in short, controlled bursts. Their weapons were weaker than Korthan plasma cannons, but they aimed for weak points, spaces between the body shields, exposed limbs, vulnerable positions. The Skrull formations continued their advance, now only 300 meters from the walls. The Korthan plasma fire was still devastating, but the enemy numbers seemed endless. For every 10 that fell, 20 more took their place. "Range 200 meters, Yuna reported. Her voice was still steady, still precise. "Eastern section showing highest concentration." Velros looked at his weapon's power indicator. He had used 30% of his charge already. At this rate, he might actually need to reload during the battle. That hadn't happened in years. Range 100 meters. They're reaching the outer defenses. The Skrull hit the first defensive line, a series of barriers and traps that the humans had set up. Explosions rippled through the enemy ranks as hidden charges detonated. More Skrull fell, but the rest kept pushing forward. Then they reached the wall itself. Velros had never fought an enemy that actually reached his defensive position before. The Skrull began climbing, using their forearms to scale the fortress walls. He switched his plasma cannon to close-range dispersal and fired down at the climbers. But there were too many. A group of Skrull reached the top of the wall 50 meters from Velros's position. Human soldiers met them immediately. Velros saw Private Gina, the young human medic he had noticed during the briefing, pull a wounded soldier to safety while firing her sidearm at the climbing Skrull with her other hand. She showed no hesitation, no panic, just smooth, practiced movements. More Skrull breached the wall in multiple locations. Close combat fighting broke out across the defensive line. This was where Korthan advantages should have been overwhelming. The Korthans were larger, stronger, better armored, but the Skrull fought with desperate fury, clawing and stabbing with all four arms. Velros saw 3 Korthan warriors get overwhelmed by a group of 20 Skrull. The Korthans fought hard, but they were being dragged down by pure numbers. They would be killed in seconds. Then Captain Day was there. The human captain charged into the mass of Skrull with a combat blade in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was smaller than everyone else in the fight, but he moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. His blade found throats and joints. His pistol fired point-blank into vital areas. He didn't waste a single movement. In less than 30 seconds, 7 Skrull lay dead around him. The rest hesitated, and that was all the time the wounded Korthans needed. Captain Day grabbed one of them and began pulling him toward safety, still firing his pistol one-handed at any Skrull that tried to follow. Velros watched this with something beyond surprise. Captain Day had just done what shouldn't be possible. A human, physically smaller and weaker than both the Korthans and the Skrull, had single-handedly rescued 3 warriors from certain death. The Korthan combat doctrine emphasized strength and firepower. Captain Day had used neither. Instead, he had been precise, brutal, and absolutely unrelenting. There was something about the way he fought that sent a chill through Velros's body. Not respect exactly, but something deeper and more uncomfortable. "All units, fall back to secondary positions," Commander Wu Jin's voice came over the communications. "Prepare to trigger Sector 2 defenses." The defenders pulled back in organized stages, with some units providing cover while others moved. The Skrull poured over the wall thinking they had won. Then Sergeant Quan Tay triggered his trap. A series of explosions tore through the courtyard behind the wall. The ground collapsed, taking hundreds of Skrell with it into prepared pits. The entire eastern section of the outer defense fell inward, burying the attackers under tons of rock and metal. The Skrell advance stopped. For a moment there was silence except for the moans of wounded and the crackling of fires. Then slowly the surviving Skrell began to retreat back toward their lines. Belros looked at the battlefield. Bodies covered the ground. Smoke rose from dozens of fires. The outer wall was damaged, but still standing. The defenders had held barely. Casualty report, Commander Wu Jin called out. The numbers came in. 42 defenders dead. Mostly Korthans who had been overwhelmed in close combat. Another 60 wounded. The humans had taken fewer losses despite being physically weaker. Belros found Captain Day checking on his soldiers, moving from position to position. The captain had a cut on his face and his armor was dented, but he was still calm and focused. "Captain?" Velros called out. Day turned to look at him. "How did you learn to fight like that?" Velros asked. Captain Day was quiet for a moment, then said, "When you're the weakest species in any fight, you learn to be the most dangerous. We've had plenty of practice, and practice where? You've only been in 3 conflicts since joining the Council." "We've been fighting our own kind for 10,000 years," Day replied, "against enemies just as smart and adaptable as we are. We learned a long time ago that strength and technology aren't everything. Sometimes the only advantage you have is refusing to quit." He paused, looking out at the battlefield. "The Skrell will come again. Probably in a few hours. They'll learn from this attack and try something different next time. That's what you need to understand about this enemy. They don't stop. They adapt and they keep coming until they win or they're all dead." "And if they keep coming?" Velros asked. Captain Day looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes. "Then we keep fighting." He walked away, leaving Velros standing there. Around him, human soldiers were already preparing for the next assault, repairing damage, redistributing ammunition, treating wounded. They moved with tired efficiency, not celebrating their survival but preparing for the next battle. Velros looked down at his own hands. They were steady, but inside his chest something felt different. He had fought in many battles, always confident in victory. But watching Captain Day fight, watching the humans prepare for another assault they might not survive, Velros felt something he had never experienced before. It wasn't quite respect. It wasn't quite fear. It was the realization that he didn't understand these humans at all, and what he didn't understand frightened him more than any enemy he had faced. The Skrell would attack again soon, and Velros was starting to realize that this battle might be very different from anything he had expected. The Skrell attacked twice more that day. Each assault was larger and more coordinated than the last. Each time the defenders held, but the cost kept climbing. By the time darkness fell on the 3rd day, the fortress had lost nearly half its Korthan warriors. The humans had suffered fewer losses, but they were exhausted and running low on medical supplies. Velros had stopped counting his kills after the 2nd day. Numbers didn't matter when the enemy kept coming in endless waves. What mattered was survival, his own and that of the soldiers around him. During the 3rd assault, a Skrell plasma blast hit Velros in his side. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but the heat burned through in one spot, searing his flesh. The pain was intense and immediate. He stumbled, his weapon dropping from his hands. Through the haze of pain, he saw Skrell soldiers moving toward him. He tried to reach for his sidearm, but his arm wouldn't respond properly. This was it. After 12 years of service, he was going to die on this forgotten fortress world. Then Private Gina was there. The human medic appeared beside him, moving in a crouch to stay below the line of fire. She grabbed his arm and began dragging him backward with strength that seemed impossible for her small frame. Her other hand held her medical kit. "Stay with me," she said, her voice firm. "You're not dying today." She pulled him behind a barrier and immediately began treating his wound. Her hands moved with practiced speed, applying field dressings and injecting something that made the pain fade to a manageable level. Above them, plasma fire and explosions continued. Pieces of debris fell around them. Gina didn't even flinch. "You're lucky," she said while working. "The blast missed anything vital. You'll have a nasty scar, but you'll live." She looked at his face. "The pain is good. Means you're alive." Then she was gone, moving to the next wounded soldier without waiting for thanks. Velros lay there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. A human medic, one-third his size, had saved his life in the middle of a battle. She had done it calmly, professionally, without any sign of fear despite the danger around her. 2 other soldiers helped Velros to the medical bunker deep inside the fortress. The pain medication Gina had given him was wearing off, and each step sent fresh waves of agony through his body. But he was alive. The medical bunker was chaos. Wounded soldiers from every species lay on beds or on the floor. Human medical staff moved between them, doing what they could with dwindling supplies. The smell of burned flesh and disinfectant filled the air. Velros was placed on a bed. A human doctor examined his wound, nodded approvingly at Gina's field treatment, and gave him something stronger for the pain. Then the doctor moved on to the next patient. There were too many wounded and not enough staff. As the medication took effect, Velros looked around the bunker. What he saw disturbed him deeply. A Korthan warrior in the bed next to him was missing his left arm. The wound was properly treated, but the loss would end his combat career. Most Korthans would accept medical discharge after such an injury. Instead, this warrior was arguing with a doctor, demanding to return to the fight. "I can still fire a weapon with one arm," the warrior insisted. "They need everyone up there." The doctor, a tired-looking human woman, shook her head. "You've lost too much blood. If you go back up there, you'll pass out and get yourself and others killed." But the warrior wouldn't accept this. Even after the doctor walked away, he kept trying to get up, only to fall back from weakness. Velros saw similar scenes throughout the bunker. Wounded soldiers, human and Korthan alike, arguing to return to battle despite horrific injuries. These weren't the actions of soldiers confident in victory. These were the actions of soldiers who knew they were losing and refused to accept it. Lieutenant Yuna entered the bunker a few hours later. She had a concussion from an explosion and was ordered to rest for at least 6 hours. She sat on a bed near Velros, looking frustrated. "How bad is it up there?" Velros asked. Yuna rubbed her temples, wincing at the pain. "Bad. We're down to less than 400 effective soldiers. The Skrell lost thousands, but they still have more coming. Reinforcements aren't due for another 4 days. We might not last 4 days." "No," Yuna agreed quietly. "We might not." They sat in silence for a while. Then Velros asked the question that had been bothering him since the fighting started. "How do humans keep fighting when you know you might lose? When you know you might die?" Yuna looked at him with surprise. "You really don't know? Korthans have never fought a battle we expected to lose. Our technology and strength have always given us overwhelming advantages. Fear of defeat is not something we experience." Yuna leaned back carefully, mindful of her concussion. "Humans have been fighting each other for most of our history. Wars that lasted years, sometimes decades. Wars where neither side had any advantage. Wars where we had to keep fighting even when we were tired, hungry, wounded, and terrified." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We learned that victory doesn't always go to the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes it goes to whoever refuses to quit. We evolved to fight wars of attrition. We learned to keep going when every logical reason said we should surrender." "That sounds like suffering," Velros said. "It was. It is." Yuna smiled slightly. "But it also taught us something important. We learned that being afraid doesn't mean you've lost. It means you understand the danger. The real question is what you do with that fear." Before Velros could respond, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, bathing everything in dim red light. Then came the sound of alarms, different from the battle alerts. These were internal breach warnings. "They're inside the fortress," Yuna said, standing up despite her concussion. She grabbed a weapon from a nearby rack. "Stay here. You're too injured to fight." But Velros couldn't stay. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side. His armor systems were still functional, including night vision. He activated it and looked around. The night vision showed nothing. The emergency lighting was too dim, and there were no other light sources. For a Korthan, this was close to blindness. Their enhanced vision required some light to amplify. In complete darkness, they were nearly helpless. Then Velros heard the sounds. Skrell voices in the corridors. The scraping of their claws on metal. They were moving through the fortress, using the darkness to their advantage. Fear. Real, genuine fear flooded through Velros's body. Not fear of death, he had faced that before. This was fear of being helpless. Fear of not being able to fight back. His advantages in strength and armor meant nothing if he couldn't see his enemies. The fear was paralyzing. He stood frozen, listening to the Skrell getting closer, unable to make himself move. Then he heard the humans. They weren't panicking. They weren't shouting. They were communicating in calm, professional voices, coordinating their movements. And they were hunting. Human soldiers had switched to night vision equipment. In the darkness that blinded the Korthans, the humans could see perfectly. They moved through the corridors with confidence, systematically eliminating the Skrell infiltrators. Captain Day's voice came over the communication channel, calm and steady as always. All human units, free fire in darkness. Watch for friendly identification signals. Korthan allies, stay in position and wait for our support. Velros listened to the sounds of fighting in the corridors, brief exchanges of gunfire, the wet sounds of blades and flesh, the occasional scream cut short. The humans were doing what they did best, adapting to circumstances that would paralyze other species. A group of Skrell entered the medical bunker. Velros could hear them but couldn't see them. He raised his weapon, trying to aim by sound alone, but his hands were shaking. The fear was overwhelming. He had never experienced true helplessness before, and it was breaking something inside him. Then a human squad entered from the other side. Their weapons fired with precise accuracy, each shot finding a target Velros couldn't see. In seconds, the Skrell were dead. Sergeant Quante approached Velros, his face barely visible behind night vision gear. "You okay?" Velros wanted to say yes. He wanted to maintain his warrior's dignity. Instead, he said, "I couldn't see them. I couldn't fight." Quante put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. We've got you." He paused, then said something that would stay with Velros forever. "Welcome to the fight. Now you know what it's like to be human." Power was restored an hour later. The Skrell infiltrators were all dead. As the lights came back on, Velros looked around the medical bunker at the human soldiers. They were exhausted, some wounded from the close combat, but they were smiling and joking with each other, not celebrating survival, preparing for the next fight. Velros sat down heavily on his bed, his hands still shaking slightly. For the first time in his life, he had experienced what these humans lived with constantly. The knowledge that they might not be strong enough, that they might fail, that they might die, and they kept fighting anyway. Lieutenant Yuna sat down beside him again. "Now you understand," she said quietly. "I think I do," Velros replied. "You've never known a battle you can't lose, so you never stop fighting," Yuna smiled. "That's about right." As dawn broke on the fourth day, Velros stood with the other defenders preparing for the next assault. His wound still hurt, and his hands occasionally trembled when he remembered the fear from the night. Commander Wu Jin called a meeting of all remaining officers on the fifth day. Velros attended, now counted among the senior leadership since so many other Korthan officers had fallen. His wound still ached, but he could function well enough. The holographic display in the operations center showed a grim picture. The fortress had held through 6 major assaults, but the cost had been terrible. Less than 400 defenders remained combat-ready. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Ammunition stocks were critically low. The Skrell had lost thousands of soldiers, but their reinforcements kept arriving. "Reinforcements will reach us in 3 days," Wu Jin said, his voice tired but steady. "The question is whether we can hold that long." One of the surviving Korthan commanders, a veteran named Korval, spoke up. "We should consider a strategic withdrawal. Evacuate while we still can. Regroup with the reinforcements and counterattack with fresh forces." Several other Korthan officers nodded agreement. It was the logical choice. Tactically sound, militarily correct, Velros found himself agreeing. They had done their duty, held far longer than anyone could have expected. There was no shame in withdrawing from an impossible position. Then he looked at the human officers' faces. Captain Day stood quietly, his expression calm but firm. Lieutenant Yuna stared at the display, her jaw tight. Sergeant Quante had his arms crossed, shaking his head slightly. Commander Wu Jin looked at the Korthan officers with something in his eyes that might have been disappointment or understanding. "We're not leaving," Captain Day said quietly. The room went silent. "Captain," Korval said, "I respect your courage, but this position is no longer tenable. We've done all that could be expected." "If we abandon Talus 9, Day interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "The Skrell will use it as a staging ground. They'll push into the Delos system, the Karthus colonies, and the Talon sector. 3 populated systems, 17 billion civilians. The Skrell don't take prisoners. They don't occupy territory peacefully. They conquer and kill. He looked around the room. We hold here or millions die. It's that simple. It's a suicide mission, another Korthan officer said. Maybe, Wu Jin replied, but it's our mission. The humans are staying. The meeting broke up with tensions high. Some Korthan officers began preparing to evacuate their troops. Others, influenced by what they had witnessed over the past 5 days, chose to stay. Velros was one of those who stayed. When Torvak asked him why, Velros couldn't give a clear answer. Logic said to withdraw. Survival instinct said to leave. But something had changed in him over these days of fighting beside humans. The thought of abandoning them felt wrong in a way that went beyond military doctrine. With the departure of some Korthan units, the defender count dropped to just under 400. The human soldiers accepted this quietly, adjusting their defensive plans without complaint or anger. They simply adapted as they always did. Sergeant Quan Te approached Captain Day with a desperate plan. The fortress had one functional orbital defense cannon remaining. It was designed to fire at ships, not ground targets. But Quan Te proposed overloading it to create a massive explosion in the Skrell staging area, several miles from the fortress. It would kill thousands of them, Quan Te explained. Destroy their supply dumps, their command structure, everything. It might buy us the 3 days we need. And the cannon? Wu Jin asked. It'll be destroyed, and someone has to plant the remote detonator on site to make sure it aims at the right coordinates. The detonator has to be within 50 meters of their main camp. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Getting to the Skrell staging area meant going through miles of enemy territory. Getting back would be even harder. It was a suicide mission with almost no chance of success. I'll need 4 volunteers, Captain Day said immediately. Every human in the room stepped forward. Velros was surprised to find himself stepping forward as well. Captain Day selected his team. Lieutenant Yuna for her reconnaissance skills. Quan Te because he knew the device best. 2 other human soldiers. And after a moment's consideration, Velros. You sure about this? Day asked Velros privately before they left. No, Velros admitted. But I'm going anyway. They left through underground tunnels that extended beyond the fortress perimeter. The tunnels had been built as supply routes but were now being used for infiltration. The team moved in complete silence, using hand signals to communicate. Velros had trained for stealth operations, but watching the humans move was enlightening. They didn't just move quietly. They seemed to disappear into shadows, to flow around obstacles without disturbing anything. Yuna led the way, somehow knowing exactly where to step to avoid detection. They traveled for hours through the tunnel system, then emerged into enemy territory. The Skrell had spread across the area, setting up thousands of temporary camps. The team had to navigate through all of it to reach the central staging area. It should have been impossible, but the humans moved through enemy positions like ghosts, and Velros followed their example. When Skrell patrols passed nearby, the team simply waited in absolute stillness until the danger passed. Velros felt the fear he had learned to recognize in the medical bunker. His heart rate was elevated. His hands wanted to shake, but he controlled it, channeling it into heightened alertness the way he had seen the humans do. They reached the staging area just before dawn. The Skrell Command Center was a massive encampment with thousands of soldiers, supply caches, and communication equipment. This was the heart of the enemy invasion force. Quan Te began setting up the targeting device while the others provided security. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of crouching in enemy territory surrounded by thousands of Skrell, knowing that discovery meant certain death. Velros had never experienced anything like this. His combat experience was all direct confrontation, strength against strength. This was different. This was operating in enemy space with no backup, no superior firepower, nothing but skill and luck. Then a Skrell patrol stumbled upon their position. The patrol leader raised an alarm horn, but Yuna shot him before he could sound it. The fight was immediate and brutal. 6 Skrell against 6 defenders. The humans fought with that terrifying efficiency Velros had learned to recognize. But there were too many Skrell in the area. More would come. Devices set, Quan Te called out. We need to go now, they ran. Behind them, Skrell soldiers poured out of the camp in pursuit. Alarms sounded across the staging area. The enemy had been alerted. The team made it perhaps half a mile before they were surrounded. Dozens of Skrell cut off their escape route. More were coming from behind. They took cover behind some rocks, but everyone knew this was the end. They couldn't fight through these numbers. Captain Day activated his communication device. Wujin, target is marked. Fire when ready. Negative, Wujin replied. You're too close to the blast zone. Get clear first, there's no time. They'll move their command center if we wait. Fire now. Captain. That's an order, Commander. Get our people home. Fire the cannon. Day looked at his team. I'm sorry. There's no other way. Then we die together, Yuna said simply. Velros should have felt terror. Instead, he felt something else, a strange calm. He was going to die. But he was going to die fighting beside these humans who had taught him what courage really meant. Then Private Gina's voice came over the communication channel. Hold position. Extraction en route. A transport vehicle burst through the Skrell lines, its armor scarred from dozens of hits. Gina was driving, having disobeyed direct orders to stay at the fortress. The vehicle skidded to a stop beside the team. Get in! She shouted. They piled into the transport. Gina gunned the engine, smashing through Skrell soldiers as she drove back toward the fortress. Plasma fire hit the vehicle from all sides. The armor held barely. Wujin, Captain Day called out. We're clear, fire. The orbital cannon activated. A beam of pure energy lanced down from space, hitting the Skrell staging area. The overload caused the entire camp to explode in a blast visible from miles away. The shockwave rocked the transport vehicle. Thousands of Skrell died in seconds. Their command structure, supply lines, and reinforcement camps were destroyed. The invasion force was broken. The transport made it back to the fortress with seconds to spare before the next assault wave. The team stumbled out, exhausted and wounded. Velros had taken 2 more hits during the escape. His armor was failing, but he was alive. Captain Day sat down heavily against a wall. His calm mask finally cracked, showing the exhaustion and fear beneath. His hands were shaking. Velros sat beside him. A human soldier brought them water. It was recycled and tasted terrible, but Velros drank it anyway. You were afraid, Velros said. It wasn't a question. Terrified, Day admitted. Every second of it. But you kept going. That's the job. Day looked at him. You felt it too, didn't you? The fear? Yes, Velros said. And I didn't know what to do with it. But then I watched all of you. You were afraid, but you fought anyway. You completed the mission anyway. You saved each other anyway. Captain Day offered him a cup of coffee from his personal supply. It was bitter and harsh, nothing like the refined drinks Korthans preferred. Velros drank it and found he didn't mind the taste. The destruction of the Skrell staging area bought them 18 hours. Not the 3 days they needed, but 18 hours. The Skrell regrouped and prepared their final assault with every remaining soldier they had. Velros stood on the wall at dawn on the 7th day, looking out at the approaching army. His armor was damaged in a dozen places. His weapons were down to their last charges. His body ached from multiple wounds, and for the first time in his military career, he was genuinely afraid of what was coming. 5,000 Skrell soldiers advanced across the rocky ground in one massive wave. This was everything they had left. The fortress defenders numbered just over 200, and most of those were wounded or exhausted. This is it, Sergeant Quante said quietly beside him. They're throwing everything at us. Velros nodded.
He had stopped trying to hide his fear.
He saw it in every face around him, human and Korthan alike. They all knew they might not survive the next few hours, but no one was running. No one was surrendering. Commander Wu Jin's voice came over all channels. All defenders, this is our final stand. We've held for 7 days. Reinforcements are 3 hours out. All we need to do is survive 3 more hours. 3 hours. It seemed like an eternity. If we can't hold the fortress, Wu Jin continued, we have rigged the inner keep with our remaining explosives. If they breach our final position, we bring the entire structure down on top of them. If we can't hold Talos 9, no one gets it. Velros understood. It was the ultimate human strategy. Deny the enemy their victory even at the cost of your own life. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. One more thing, Wu Jin said, his voice carrying something that might have been pride. You've all fought with courage that will be remembered. Human, Korthan, and every other species here. We've stood together and will stand together to the end. It's been an honor. The communication ended. The Skrell army kept advancing. Velros raised his plasma cannon, knowing it had perhaps 20 shots left before the power cell died completely. Ready? Captain Day asked from his position to Velros's right. No, Velros admitted. But I'll fight anyway, Day smiled. That's the spirit. The battle began. The Skrell hit the outer defenses like a tsunami, overwhelming them through sheer numbers. The defenders fought from every prepared position, but they were simply outnumbered. The outer wall fell within 20 minutes. The defenders retreated to the second defensive line. This was where Velros saw something that would stay with him forever. Private Gina, the young medic, standing over 3 wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. She was firing her weapon with one hand while trying to stabilize a critical patient with the other. She should have retreated with the others. Instead, she stayed. A group of Skrell rushed her position. Velros turned his cannon toward them and fired his last 3 shots, killing most of them. Then his weapon went dead, the power cell completely drained. He drew his sidearm and ran toward Gina's position, joining 2 other Korthan warriors doing the same. They reached her just as the remaining Skrell attacked. Close combat fighting broke out. Velros fought with everything he had, fists, blade, his armored body as a weapon. The Skrell clawed and bit and stabbed. One of the Korthan warriors fell, then the other. Then Captain Day and Lieutenant Yuna arrived with reinforcements. Together they drove back the Skrell and evacuated Gina and her patients to the next defensive line. The battle continued. The defenders kept falling back from position to position, making the Skrell pay for every meter. But the enemy kept coming. The second defensive line fell. Then the third. Within an hour, the defenders were pushed back to the inner keep, the final position. 200 soldiers had become less than 150. Commander Wu Jin stood at the center of the keep, his hand on the detonator for the explosives. All remaining defenders fall back to the keep. Prepare for final stand. The survivors gathered in the keep. They were bloody, exhausted, and almost out of ammunition, but they stood together, watching the Skrell army mass outside for their final assault. Velros found himself standing between Captain Day and Sergeant Quan Tay. Private Gina was there too, still trying to treat wounded despite having a broken arm herself. Lieutenant Yuna was positioning the remaining soldiers for maximum defensive coverage. 2 hours left, Quan Tay said, checking his chronometer. We just need to hold 2 more hours. We can do it, Gina said. Her voice was strained with pain, but her eyes were determined. The Skrell began their final assault. They poured into the keep from multiple entrances, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer mass. The fighting was brutal and close. There was no room for tactics anymore, just survival. Velros fought alongside the humans with his last weapon, a combat blade he had taken from a fallen comrade. He was afraid. His hands shook between engagements. His body wanted to flee, but he looked at the humans around him, still fighting despite their fear, and he found the strength to continue. Captain Day was everywhere, rallying soldiers, filling gaps in the line, keeping the defense organized even as chaos erupted around them. Lieutenant Yuna had run out of ammunition and was fighting with a blade. Quan Tai was using improvised explosives made from equipment parts. The Skrell breached the inner chamber. Commander Wu Jin stood with his hand on the detonator, ready to end everything. Velros saw in his eyes that the commander was prepared to die rather than let the fortress fall. Then, like a miracle, alarms sounded, but different alarms. Not warnings. These were friendly approach signals. Lieutenant Yuna checked her tactical display, her eyes going wide. They're here. The reinforcements are here. Orbital strikes began hitting the Skrell positions outside the fortress. Korthan warships had arrived early, having pushed their engines beyond safe limits to reach the battle. The devastating firepower from space tore through the Skrell army in seconds. The Skrell in the keep tried to retreat, but they were trapped. The defenders, finding new energy despite their exhaustion, drove them back and eliminated the remaining enemy forces, and then, suddenly, it was over. The battle ended not with a dramatic final moment, but with exhausted silence. The survivors stood among bodies and debris, trying to process that they had survived. Velros sat down against a wall, his blade falling from his hand. Around him, other soldiers were doing the same, collapsing from exhaustion now that the adrenaline was fading. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Most were just silent, staring at nothing. Captain Day moved through the room, checking on his soldiers. When he reached Velros, he simply sat down beside him. "We did it," Day said quietly. "We did," Velros agreed. He looked around at the survivors. "How many?" 143 out of 800, Una reported, her voice hollow. 82% casualties, the numbers were staggering. But they had held. Against impossible odds, they had held. The Korthan fleet commander arrived at the fortress several hours later to personally commend the defenders. Admiral Korthan was a legendary warrior, decorated from 50 campaigns. He walked through the ruined fortress looking at the damage, the bodies, the blood. He stopped in front of Captain Day. "What made the difference? How did you hold against such overwhelming odds?" Captain Day gestured to his remaining soldiers, humans and Korthans alike, wounded and exhausted but still standing. "We learned to be afraid together, and we fought anyway." The Admiral didn't seem to understand, but Velros did. He understood completely. A formal ceremony was held 3 weeks later, after the survivors had been evacuated and given medical treatment. Velros stood in formation, his wounds mostly healed but the scars permanent. Around him were the other defenders, dressed in their formal uniforms. They received the highest military honors from both human and Korthan governments. Medals, commendations, speeches about courage and sacrifice. It was all very official and proper. But for Velros, the real honor had been fighting beside these humans. Learning what they knew, feeling what they felt, understanding what true courage meant. After the ceremony, as Velros prepared to board a transport to his next assignment, Captain Day approached him. "Where are they sending you?" Day asked. "A new joint unit. Humans and Korthans working together." Velros paused. "What about you?" "Same. We're building more mixed units after what happened at Talos 9. Command wants to spread the lessons we learned." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Day extended his hand in the human gesture of respect. Velros took it carefully, mindful of his greater strength. "Thank you," Velros said, "for teaching me." "Teaching you what?" "What fear truly is, and what to do with it." Day smiled. "You were a good student." As Velros boarded his transport, he carried with him something he hadn't had before, a small patch from Captain Day's unit. He attached it to his armor beside his Korthan insignia, a reminder. The transport lifted off, taking him toward his next assignment. Other Korthan soldiers would ask him questions about humans, about what they were like in combat, about whether the stories from Talos 9 were exaggerated. Velros already knew what he would tell them. "Humans taught me what fear truly is. They live with it every day, in every fight, because they've never had the luxury of overwhelming advantage. They learned 10,000 years ago that being afraid doesn't mean you're losing. It means you understand the danger,